Hi, everybody. We are going to start talking about the cardiovascular system. And the first part of the cardiovascular system, we are focusing on blood as the connective tissue. We will learn about the functions, the cells, and the functions associated with each of the cellular components of blood. So, to start with looking at some of the functions associated with blood, we have transportation of gases, nutrients, hormones, and metabolic waste. So if you go ahead and take a look at the word nutrients, in this case, the word nutrients implies the main component, which is in your case and in your body would be glucose. Since if you remember, we had blood glucose, measurement of blood glucose at certain numbers because your cells use that as a source of energy. The second thing that your blood has the ability to do is regulation of your blood pH, ion composition, and interstitial fluid, which is shorthanded to IF. Now, for regulation of pH, something that you need to know is that your blood pH ranges from 7.35 to 7.45, and it can accomplish that by relying on the buffer system called bicarbonate, if you guys remember that, which is HCO3 minus. And we'll discuss this in both respiratory system, urinary system, as well as we're discussing it in the sense of blood. Now, the next option that you have is restriction of fluid loss. So in this case, we're actually talking about two components. One we already talked about in a sense of tissue, which is platelets. Now the second one, which is actually a plasma protein called fibrinogen, it also plays a role, and again, we'll discuss this as we go through the PowerPoint. So the next part is defending of your body activity. And for the defense, the main type of cells that we have is basically your white blood cells, which we also call leukocytes, that play a major role in the immunity. And in addition to be found in your lymphatic system, we also have them as part of your blood cells. Last one is regulation of body temperature. So body temperature we discussed is maintained as 34 degrees centigrade. And if you guys remember back, the homeostasis of your body temperature was when you're hot, you basically flush because of vasodilation. And when you're cold, your skin turns pale, and that's because of vasoconstriction. And basically, by having the changes in the blood vessels of the changes of the diameter of the blood vessels, you can maintain your body temperature. Now, the next thing you need to notice is when you compare the fluid or blood volume in males versus females, females on average have about a liter less than males. The reason for that is males have a larger muscle mass, and the way you want to think about it, the more muscles you have, the more oxygen and nutrients you have to supply them. Now, to accomplish the higher blood volume, we actually rely on a hormone called testosterone. Which is the major male hormone responsible as one of its functions, responsible for production of higher levels of blood cells. Now, if I take a look at the blood composition, and this should sound familiar to you from the histology and tissue review, your blood is actually made up of two components. It has the cellular components, which are, if you recall, is white blood cell, which you can see as these larger cells with very pronounced nucleus. You have red blood cells, which we call them erythrocytes, and you notice that majority of the cells you see in the background are erythrocytes, and they're identified by a clear lack of nucleus. And these fragments that you see right here are identified as platelets, which are called thrombocytes. Now, in addition to having these cellular components, which we identified as formed elements, you also have the liquid component of blood, which is basically plasma. A review of the information we discussed early on during the first unit, we had ECF, which is basically extracellular fluid, which was made up of plasma, which is what's found inside the blood, and the interstitial fluid, which we shorthand to IF. Combination of these two formed your extracellular fluid, or basically the fluid outside your cells. So let's go ahead and take a look at how your blood composition changes as you spin the sample to separate them based on their weight and their density. So here you can see that this individual is basically, you're taking a blood sample from this individual. You then centrifuge the sample, which hopefully we get the chance to do in your lab. You centrifuge the sample, which basically means you start to spin the sample very rapidly. That allows the component to be separated easily. And you can see that there are three separate levels being formed here. The first layer, which is the lightest of the three layers, is your plasma. So plasma, as we will learn, is mostly water, and water is not necessarily heavy, correct? So it would basically form the top layer. The second layer, which is relatively small, typically less than 1% of the total blood volume, is called the buffy coat, and it's made up of your white blood cells, leukocytes, and your platelets, which are also known as thrombocytes. Erythrocytes, which are your red blood cells, contain a protein called hemoglobin, sorry, I'm going to go off the D, which is usually shorthand to HB. It has a really high concentration of these proteins. So basically these proteins weight the cell down and making your erythrocyte to be the heaviest component of your blood, forming an average about 45% of your whole blood volume in average. Now notice that up here, one thing that I mentioned is the word called hematocrit. Hematocrit is the percentage of red blood cells in total blood. So basically what I have here as 45% is basically representing the hematocrit. Now a couple of points to keep in mind. When a person is dehydrated, it means it has lost blood. Hematocrit, and I'm not going to spell the whole thing. Well, I think I do. Hematocrit percentage will increase because now you have more of the red blood cell in relation to the plasma, because some of the water has been evaporated. So basically you will have more red blood cells in relation to your whole blood. And again, opposite of dehydration would be overhydration. So if you're overhydrated, then your hematocrit percentage will decrease and your plasma level in relationship will increase. Something else that you need to think about is infection. Infection is basically you have some sort of viral, bacterial, parasitic infection that is going to increase the concentration of your white blood cells. So in this scenario, if you have an infection, there will be an increase in your buffy coat. Okay? So there are different conditions, different components of blood is affected. So make sure you guys feel comfortable with that information. Now let's go ahead and start taking a look at the component of blood in a little bit more detail. So we're going to start by looking at your plasma, which forms about 55% of your total blood volume, as you can see right here. In reality, it's kind of a yellowish color. It is a sticky, and as you notice, it contains a significant amount of water, 90% water. So fluidity of your blood, again, comes from the fact that plasma contains a significant amount of water. But as you notice, it contains ion, nutrients, waste, and proteins. So ion examples would be basically potassium, sodium, calcium, etc., etc. Nutrients, the main one again would be glucose or amino acids or fats. Waste typically are identified as uric acid, not the only one, but the two main common one is uric acid and urea. And for the proteins, we have the three most common type of protein which are listed here as albumin, globulin, and fibrinogen, which I mentioned earlier. Now, the key point that you guys do need to remember for the proteins of your proteins of your plasma, that all of them are produced by your liver. So your blood technically doesn't produce any plasma proteins. All it does, it receives those from your liver and then gets transported into your blood again. So if you do have some sort of liver disease, like let's say liver cancer, or you have hepatitis, any form of hepatitis, but the typical one, hepatitis B or C, then as a result, then you will see a decrease in the concentration of these proteins, and you will see that in the sense of their functionality of the proteins in your whole body. So let's go ahead and look at these proteins in a bit more detail. Starting with the single one, the most common one, which is your albumin, forming about 60% of your total blood plasma, which is significant. Now, what is its goal? What is its function? The most important function it has is osmotic pressure. So let's take a look at what osmotic pressure means in a sense of osmotic pressure. What does that mean? So let's think about this is your blood, and inside your blood you have albumin. And albumin is considered to be a solute. And on the surrounding your blood and surrounding your blood vessels, you have your interstitial fluid. So if you guys understand the concept of osmotic pressure, it was described as solutes pull on water. So the more solute you have, the stronger the pull of your water will be. So in this sense, since albumin is going to be considered as really large solute molecules, it has the ability to pull water into your blood. So this arrow represents H2O. It pulls water into your blood and be able to maintain both the blood total volume as well as make sure that the fluid does not stay at high concentration inside your IF. Now let's assume that you have some sort of liver disease. So if you have some sort of liver disease, then your solute, which is again is represented as albumin, concentration will decline. So instead of water staying inside your blood vessel, blood is going to leak out into your interstitial fluid. When that takes place, that usually causes the tissue to swell, and the swelling of the tissue is identified as edema. So in many patients, if they have liver disease or some sort of problem with their livers, depending on the type of problem, typically the albumin concentration drops, and one of their symptoms would be swelling or edema of the tissue. Now, the second type of proteins that we have is called the globulin, not to be mixed with globin. It's about 36%. It's still produced by your liver, but its job is most likely similar to a taxi driver or a taxi. It transports vitamins, metals, ions, lipids, and in some cases also acts as antibody. Lastly is fibrinogen, which is about 4% of total blood plasma. It's still made up by your liver. And again, its role is blood clotting, which means this protein is working with the cell types we talked about earlier called platelets, to make sure that if you do have some sort of cut or damage to your blood vessels, they can be healed easily. Now, Again, anytime you hear the word formed elements are implying basically the cells that are found inside. In this case, as we discussed, we have erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. Be able to identify each of these tissues within a picture. So I'm going to start mentioning the erythrocytes and then we'll expand on it in the next presentation. So first thing, when you look at your red blood cells or your erythrocytes, they're relatively small. So they're about 7.5 micrometers, not millimeters, micrometers, which basically implies that when they are passing through the capillary network, which are the smallest sort of blood vessels we have, they line up at one at a time. So think about your capillaries as a road that is one lane and it allows one car to pass at a time. Your cars in this case would be your red blood cells. Now, again, since we talked about this earlier, male will have a higher concentration of red blood cells compared to females because of the higher muscle mass. Very fascinating fact about the red blood cells is that they do not have any organelles or a nucleus. As you can see, there is nothing that is stained purple that identifies as nucleus. Now, keep in mind that because the cell does not have nucleus and organelles, they live a relatively short life of about 100 to 120 days. Again, making the connection is the lack of organelles and nuclei limits red blood cell ability to fix itself, fix or repair itself. So basically, anytime it gets old or damaged, basically you just have to break it down and form new cells. What is the main job of hemoglobin? What is the main job of red blood cells? As we mentioned earlier, is to carry O2, but it also carries, as you will learn, also carries CO2, but the main function would be again carrying oxygen in a form of oxygen molecule. Now, if you look inside a red blood cell, so if I look inside of these red blood cells, what is it packed with? Is with hemoglobin protein, as it's mentioned here. And hemoglobin protein is the one that actually carries out the oxygen within the red blood cells. You will learn about this in the next presentation, but let me just kind of familiarize you with it. There are 250 million hemoglobin per red blood cell. So significant numbers. As far as the origin of production of your red blood cells, they originate from not just the bone marrow, they actually originate from the red bone marrow, and this is found inside your spongy bones. You will learn about that also later on in Bio 251. Let's just finish this up and then we'll pick it up on your next presentation.